This weekend, hey, they haven't sold off the national parks and closed them to the public yet. Let's travel out beyond the western edge of early 19th century America and look at some of the things that created confusion and fed the jingoism that would drive the manifest destiny narrative that centered much of the next half century. We're headed out way west to Tumacacori near the southern border of the state of Arizona. This is an area that's been in the crossroads of North American settlement for thousands of years. The O'odham people maintain some of the oldest agriculture on the continent in this area. And this tribe was encountered by the Spanish as they moved up from Central America to claim new lands for the crown and the cross. The Jesuits were always on the lookout for new places to set up churches in North America after being decisively ejected from Florida by the locals. And the state-sponsored, or at least acknowledged explorers were always on the lookout for silver. Both groups found what they were looking for, as well as a bunch of oak trees. If you ever see the mountains of Spain and compare it to the dry oak hills of the American Southwest, it becomes clear why they named it New Spain. I mean, it seriously looks like more Spain. Just add pigs, grapes, and olives and, ta-da! Anyway, the word Arizona was the name given to a ranch in this area, which is Basque for the good oak. Soon after that, silver discovered in the area was described as Arizona silver, which led to a local silver rush long before the gold rush of the 1850s, further north in California. As a result, the entire region soon took on the name Arizona, which led to the name of the territory and then the state. Silver, salt, and later copper would all attract American interests in these high desert areas as the country continued to expand west. The connection of the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic via the Transcontinental Railroad, starting at Council Bluffs, Iowa, would only cause the westward expansion to go that much faster. And as it did, places like Tumacacori, that already had long and complex histories, would get swallowed up in the race for the coast and the riches underground. With all that history stacked up on top of itself, the park gives an intriguing window into the life at the edge of the American desert, and how 3 different cultures saw the land and how they chose to use it. You can read all about this stuff or even watch videos, but there is something very different about standing in the hot, dry air, smelling the sagebrush, listening to the insects and the bird noises, and watching the shadows crawl across the ground while thinking about building mud brick villages or churches and ranches in this section of high desert. And Tumacacori National Historical Park makes the opportunity open to all to ponder how history continues to turn around these places. Just please bring your own water bottle, pick up after yourself, and stay on the trails, because right now the rangers just have too much to deal with. Episode 149, Trains and Buying Stuff in the Early 19th Century, the Birth of American Consumer Culture. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the first half of the 19th century laid the groundwork for the full explosion of the Industrial Revolution in the second half of the century. How did the railroads get started, and what did the roots of American consumer culture look like, and how is it all connected to our food past, present, and future? So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the first railroads in America were actually populated with horse-drawn vehicles. That's right. While we think of railroads as a package of rails and fuel-powered locomotives and freight and passenger cars as one whole package, the emergence of the modern railroad came together piecemeal. In fact, back in the early 19th century, basically every method of travel was thought of in terms of roads. There were the established sea roads, charted routes captains would follow to Europe, China, India, and on to the whaling grounds. A new system of canals being built were considered roads with their dedicated tow paths, and then there were wagon and carriage roads. So the roads that were lined with rails were just another sort of road. But for many, they were a strange sort of road, and possibly a dangerous or unnecessary one. Why pour all of this treasure and iron into a clearly dangerous technology? After all, steam engines at this time were more noted for their popularity with eccentric gentlemen and catastrophic explosions than as useful machinery, with plenty of sensational examples. As the 19th century opened, Pennsylvania had almost 2,000 miles of turnpike, much of it stone paved. New York had 4,000 miles, and Massachusetts had over 1,000. The Erie Canal was proving its utility even before it was finished, and by 1820, over 10,000 miles of canals were proposed from Georgia to Massachusetts and from Pennsylvania to the likely-looking territories along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and around the promising-looking Great Lakes. Especially now that the battles with the English over where Canada should end had been resolved with the end of the War of 1812 due to the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. If anything, railroads and steam locomotives to run on them were much like the first personal computers of the 1970s. Strange machines with no clear use. No market existed for them, as there were few people who understood how to use them or what they might be useful for. As a result, the early railways were being built piecemeal, chaotically and often wastefully, and were targets for visionaries, crackpots, conmen, and swindlers. And in this world without regulation, the men pushing the known edges of mechanical engineering caused the loss of thousands of lives through ignorance, callousness, carelessness, and greed. But since danger in the realm of the railroad was not particularly surpassed by industries such as shipping, fishing, whaling, mining, iron refining, glass making, gunpowder manufacture, or any number of the developing industries of the era, the casualty numbers of the developing railroads just didn't stand out. I mean, simply giving birth to a child or being an infant or child under the age of 5 were similarly perilous ventures in the early 19th century. Aspects of healthcare, sanitation, and safety we have taken for granted at the end of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st were simply unknown at the time. But all that daring do, danger, and death did little to cool a growing enthusiasm for the promise of possibly more rapid and dependable travel as this new country expanded. And now expansion meant not just over the Appalachian Range. Now it started to include the lakes of the north and seemed to encouraging following the rivers at the center to their sources. So what makes up the package of the railway we appreciate today? First, roads. Something established as the way to go. Finding ways through the wilderness, or more often adopting and expanding tracks and trails created by the local tribes, were some of the first roads in America. From there, turnpikes were built between outlying farming communities to bring produce to towns and port cities. But of course, overland travel for cargo is pricey and slow. The pig drives prove that, along with the propensity of grain farmers in the early American outlands to turn their surplus into liquor for ease of transport. This led to a boom in canal building. Better than land roads, they were still subject to the vagaries of the season, freezing up in winter or suffering from low water at the end of the summer. Hoping you'd get enough rain to fill up the canals for transporting your harvest to the ports, but not too much rain so it would ruin the harvest, was an interesting needle to thread for our early 19th century farmers. But because freight rates were 1/10 or less of the road freight rates, that made it so people were willing to put up with some accidents and bad luck over no transport at all. So the first step in railroads, then, was finding the routes on which to lay rail. And when it comes to rail, those too have been in use for far longer than we think. In fact, using rails to haul cargo long predates any sort of mechanical propulsion by hundreds and possibly thousands of years. The first rails are generally considered to be sled or sleigh runners, attaching them to planks to slide over ice and snow. This meant less surface area in contact with the ground, required less muscle power to overcome friction and pull the things along. Later, when heavy loads had to be pulled repeatedly over the same ground, it made more sense to lay down rails and pull cargo across that, rather than to run ruts into a road. Mine shafts with carts are thought to be the first place this sort of rails were used. From mine ponies and pre-industrial Welsh tin mines to modern rail cars in modern copper pit mines, laying tracks and rails to allow transport to cover the same ground over and over without it rutting out the ground is generally considered the first use of cargo moved on a fixed rail. This idea was brought to America, where there is plenty of iron, silver, and salt mines. But the place a railroad most appealed was to transport cargo over places that were steep or bogged down in seasonal rains that washed through in the spring, fall, and winter in different parts of the expanding country. Since you are already familiar with the fact that America had limited capacity to produce iron, but was swimming in wood, you likely won't be surprised to learn that the first rails under American rail cars were actually timber beams covered with a cast iron ribbon. These strap iron rails were made of two things that behaved very differently under a variety of conditions. But since material science wasn't really a thing at this point, people soon were surprised by the consequence of binding together wood and cast iron because they had different expansion and contraction tendencies. While wood swells in wet conditions and shrinks when it gets dry, the iron was unaffected. And wood doesn't particularly change size in different temperatures. But the thin iron straps on top of the wood would buckle in the heat, creating what were known as snakeheads, which would cause an extra bumpy ride along with the occasional car puncture and derailment. Because the wood didn't have the strength to support the heavy rail cars themselves, the roadbed they were laid on was cut stones, making the early railroads of America an unconscious echo of the stone roads of ancient Rome that revolutionized the speed of travel throughout Europe a few millennia earlier. Laying these roads was a challenge. At this point in American history, there was very little sense of America as a union. States viewed themselves as fiercely separate. Approval for a project in one state had absolutely no promise of continuation in the next. And the early road and canal projects reflect this reality. Turnpikes, the major roadways of commerce and canals, were all projects within a single state. The Erie Canal was a New York project, and the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts turnpikes were their own deals. So it makes sense that the earliest railways were projects mounted within a single state. The first charter for a railway was granted in New Jersey in 1815, and in a few years there were plans and charters for 200 others. The first railway that was built and in use was the Baltimore and Ohio in Maryland. That is, from Baltimore to the Ohio River, though actually reaching the Ohio was a goal for the future. While the railroad opened for operation in 1830 with horse-drawn cars on a 13-mile stretch from the port to Ellicott's Mills, now Ellicott City, the railway wouldn't reach the Ohio River until 1852. More important than reaching the Ohio was the adoption of the steam engine by the B&O Railroad in 1831. Steam boilers driving engines had their first exposure to the American public as drivers of boats. The paddle boats of the rivers and steamships that were starting to ply the coastal freight routes along America were proving that, while finicky and subject to the occasional explosion, they were promising. More expensive than canal freight routes, they were also faster. And as a way to move as a passenger, they certainly beat the plodding pace of the towpath mule or the punishingly rattling road coach travel. Steam engines and boats, and soon train locomotives, were initially wood-fired, so the boilers needed a network to regularly provide them with both wood and water. Converting steam engines to coal would be the next step that would make transatlantic trips possible, and then the later steamers to India, to China, and then to power new kinds of trade, whaling, fishing, and war on all the oceans of the earth. But I am getting ahead of myself. How exactly did the rail networks of the United States go from hobby loops on the estates of rich men and a single horse-drawn line in Maryland to the two distinct rail networks at the eve of the Civil War? And how did the emerging rail networks and emerging consumer culture shape each other? In the days before rail, there were two types of retail goods bought and sold in these early states. There were the local goods, things that were perishable and delicate, liquid milk, eggs, some local fruits and vegetables, fresh fish, bird flesh, and fresh meat, that is, pork, beef, and mutton. Then there were the more and less shelf-stable goods, nails, salted fish and salted meat, butter, cheese, pickled vegetables, and oysters, as well as grains like wheat, rye, corn, and rice. Metal, glass, and cloth were becoming more available as the early industrial centers developed. Thread and cloth mills in Massachusetts, glass works in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, iron works all over, and the new steel refineries that fed into products like plows, wire, and the wheels and gears and boilers needed to help America step into the industrial garments of the mechanized America that would emerge over the second half of the century. And all of this was fed by the production and concentration of the raw materials required to make all of this stuff. Timber and pitch, cotton, rice, indigo, sugar, metal ores, and all those animals, cattle, pigs, and sheep, that produced the meat, leather, wool, and such that went into all those products. Before railroads, moving these raw materials was slow and expensive, so a few solutions were typically employed. The first was to convert the raw material, say iron ore, into something rather valuable on the spot. The mining, refining, and working into a finished product, say a decorative fireback or pot, was all done in one region, which is why the iron-rich Pennsylvania hills became known for their 7- and 10-plate stoves, and the corn and rye fields of the Appalachians became known for their whiskeys. Another was to grow products that could walk themselves to market, thus the pig, cattle, and even fall turkey drives to bring livestock from where the land was cheap to where the customers were. And the final strategy was to use water for transport of bulky raw materials, thus the immediate popular and wild success of the Erie Canal and the fact that many southern plantations had their own cargo docks. If you look at maps of major transport in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, they all look like funnels into their port cities. Nearly all transportation is from the sources into the ports. There is very little development of any sort of network within any of these states and territories. But the mid-Atlantic states, New England, and what was becoming the Northwest, that is the area under the Great Lakes, well, yes, they were growing food. They were also getting into the business of making things and selling them to each other. Plows, glass bottles, gears, grass seed for cow pasture, milk cans, hams, saddles, axes, saw blades, and wood rails to make railroads. So when it came time to start laying railroad tracks, sure, there definitely needed to be tracks built to the ports, to Albany, to New York, to Boston, New Bedford, Philadelphia, Providence, and Wilmington, but there also needed to be track laid from town to town. So while those states were looking both within and to a greater trading network, the southern states were more concerned on growing stuff to make stuff. As a result, the early railways in these areas also all went to the ports. Since every major producer was more or less in competition with their neighbors for exporting the same or similar produce, cotton, rice, indigo, pitch, shipboard beef, they saw no need to create even a rudimentary grid for trade within the states. Which meant that, as the rail networks grew, they looked very different and grew at very different speeds. Between 1830 and 1840, the amount of rail grew from 1,000 miles to 3,000 miles, and 22 of the now 26 admitted states had laid at least their first mile of track. But it was chaos. There were 60 different lines, and they were largely unconnected. This, of course, was partly due to the fact that there were at least a dozen gauges in use, that is, the distance between the rails. There were also very few bridges over rivers or across state lines, requiring the transfer to ferries and fords. This need to switch passengers, bags, and baggage from train to other train was a boon for taverns, innkeepers, teamsters, and porters. Over the next decade, into the 1850s, the amount of track would triple again to over 9,000 miles of track. And in the last decade leading up to the Civil War, track would triple once more to 30,000 miles. With different priorities in each region, very different rail maps would develop. New England, with its priorities in both global and interstate trade, would crisscross itself with 10,000 miles of track. Of course, the ever-growing and increasingly dense cities would keep up a steady drumbeat of sensationalist horror stories decrying these screaming monsters flinging smuts and coals about and running over children and city livestock. However, the call to money and adventure would drown these out, much in the same way the early difficult days of travel across the sea had called to people in the previous century. The expanding Northwest, what would soon come to be known as the Old Northwest or the Midwest, laid down an impressive 11,000 miles of track. Granted, they had the widest open spaces, were not quite so inundated with rivers, and had left the daunting engineering challenges of mountain ranges behind them. The wheat, cattle, butter, cheese, salt, iron ore, pickled lakefish, and furs and glass-making sands created return cargo to balance out the growing traffic of hopeful lakeshore prairie farmers, fur trappers, tavern keepers, and all their supplies that were working their way out to this new West, beyond the Old West of Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Despite its early lead in riches and population and area of land claimed, the South fell behind with its rail construction of only 9,000 miles of track. And as with its road and canal construction before, most of the rail was concentrated on moving raw materials out of the states for use in other players. There was still very little interest in developing local industry and trade. So what did this 30,000 miles of track mean for you, a consumer, in this rudimentary rail network, or funnel, depending on where you lived? In the places where railroads were concentrated on the moving out of raw materials, unless you were of the very upper crustiest crust and might travel and consume luxury goods from afar, you saw very little change. Going from any largish city to another was made no easier. Traveling within a given region was about the same, by water, rough carriageway, or on foot, or by horse. If you were not headed towards the port, there was nothing really new. So that meant the perishable and non-perishable divide of goods stayed more or less the same. You saw the same pickled ox tongues, brandy, and cloth arriving by train from the port, though there might also be a few new medicinal mixtures in these newfangled stamped bottles to help with the ever-present ailments. And maybe you could get brimstone powder, that is, sulfur, instead of just the larger chunks it used to come in to help with the cleaning and keeping the ham skippers down. But in the parts of the country where trains were starting to move around north and south, east and west, things were different. Not only were more of the shelf-stable goods arriving, more kinds were arriving as well. If you had a larger market for your goods that you could spread around without loading up your personal mule or paying for ruinous road freight rates, well, the creation of a new business to sell a saddle soap or a new design of a glass chimney for the spreading new oil lamps, well, this ever-expanding web of railways made the math pencil out. And the reduction in cost of transporting iron ore and coal and finished products meant that wrought iron rails and eventually the T-shaped Vignoles rails we are now familiar with would start to be installed in Pennsylvania in 1831, and steel rails would start to appear in 1857. The more dependable and durable wrought iron and then steel rails reduced the time required to build railway, but not really the cost. A gravel bed with timber ties replaced those stone roads required by the wooden iron strap rails, a technology that aided the rapid expansion of the 1840s through the 1860s. And sure, the wrought iron and steel rails were more expensive, but they required less skill to lay, a gravel bed versus a stone road, and they lasted much longer than the iron straps pinned to wood. And so, the growing interconnection of the country through rail, and both its costs and opportunities for profits, both for the rail owners and the customers, meant that a uniquely sprawling economy of goods was starting to develop in the new United States. The railroads could not be profitable if there was nothing to move on them, so goods were encouraged to use them, but the goods had to be engineered to become profitable through their transport on the railways. The idea that goods were made more profitable by moving them around, by taking advantage of this emerging network of more and more rapid and connected transportation, meant that any dream of America remaining an eat local society was already falling apart. Its demise was laid all the way back here in the 1830s. Farming and manufacturing and population centers could now be situated in uniquely American ways. The distribution and concentration of farmland, manufacturing centers, and population we see now, that shift was guided by the emergence of the railroad already in the first half of the 19th century. Certainly no one back then could be sure of where they were going, but looking back there from here, you can see how the farmless, house-rich suburbs and massive farms with almost no homes at all developed. As people in Philadelphia, New Orleans, Chicago, and Fort Wayne started tasting New York cheddar, as the residents of Albany and Columbus began to sample Chesapeake oysters and cloth made in the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, this was all spelling the end of mercantilism, especially since that cloth was made with American cotton brought north by the new steamboats and steamships. The American Railroad accelerated the growth of modern capitalism and gave us our American spin on it. Now, if you crave a quick review of mercantilism versus capitalism and how they are all tied into food, go back and revisit the early seasons, but especially episodes 11 and 50, and learn about the rimless wheel. And then after you're done pondering barrels of Erie Canal butter and the nerve-wracking job of considering where to put barrels of DuPont gunpowder on these early risky trains, you can start to look ahead to the topic of the next episode, the reversal of fortune experienced by the American lobster. From poor man's chicken to being paired with champagne, the lobster, more or less minding its own bottom-feeding business, is going to really take it in the claw. And all of it comes back to the can. And of course, trains and codfish are somehow responsible as well. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know that you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. And it's fun to hear from you on all the social medias. After all, quips and responses around trains and beef and novelties made it clear that it was time to dig into the fortunes of lobster. I appreciate knowing that you're listening and enjoying the show, and that you have opinions about it. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food. And all this information is available in the show description.